The night Lucia Marchetti walked into that ballroom, she had no idea she was walking into the most dangerous room in the entire country. She had no idea that the man sitting at the head table, the one in the black suit, the one who looked like he owned the air around him, had built that entire event from the ground up. She had no idea that 40 of his men were positioned around that room at that very moment. And she had absolutely no idea that in approximately 4 minutes, she was going to slap him across the face in front of every single one of them. But here's what made that night different from every other night in Nico Carbone's life. He didn't have her killed. He didn't even have her removed. He smiled slowly, like a man who had just found something he hadn't known he was looking for. And he said 4 words that changed both their lives completely. But getting to that very night, was going to cost them both more than either of them could have predicted, standing in that ballroom with the string quartet frozen mid-note and 500 people holding their breath. This is the story of the charity slap. And it starts, like all the best stories do, with a woman running late.
Before we go any further, if you are already hooked, then do us a favor right now and hit that like button. Subscribe if you haven't already, and share this with someone who lives for a story that actually delivers. We put everything into this one. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let's begin.
She was 7 minutes late and entirely unbothered by it. Lucia Miller moved through wet November pavement at the pace of someone who understood that urgency and panic were 2 completely different things, and had made a firm lifelong commitment to only one of them. Her second-hand heels cracked against the concrete. A box of pink ribbon centerpieces was balanced against her chest. Her hair was half-pinned, and she had on a black dress she'd borrowed from her colleague Renata, who was 2 inches shorter. But what choice did she have? She thought about her mother on nights like this. Not heavy grief like before. The kind that ambushed her in the cereal aisle when she spotted a brand her mother used to buy, or at 3 a.m. when the hospital ward went quiet, leaving her alone with only memories of her mother. This was the lighter kind of grief. The almost warm kind, if I may. The kind that arrived as her mother's voice. "Lucia, you would be late to your own funeral." And Lucia would say, had always said, could still hear herself saying it, "But I'd get there, Mama. I always get there." And indeed she always got there. The Grand Meridian Ballroom was already breathing when she slipped through the service corridor. 500 guests in black tie, chandeliers throwing fractured gold across champagne flutes and pearl necklaces, and the careful smiles of people who had paid $10,000 a plate to feel generous for an evening. The string quartet played something aching through the hum of conversation. Lucia ducked past a catering trolley, traded her centerpieces for a volunteer lanyard, straightened her dress with one hand, and stepped into the glittering edge of a world she visited but had never once confused for her own. She didn't mind the distinction. She was not here for the glamour. Her eyes found the cause first, the donation banner along the far wall, the research display panels with their columns of clinical data, survivor statistics, and photographs of women in hospital gowns holding handwritten signs. She moved toward the photographs the way some people moved toward windows in unfamiliar rooms. She stopped in front of one longer than the rest, a woman with a wide smile and tired eyes and a pink ribbon at her collar, laughing at whoever was behind the camera with the absolute commitment of someone who had decided that laughter was non-negotiable regardless of circumstances. Her mother had a photograph almost exactly like this one. She was 44 years old when she died, and that laugh was what Lucia had missed first, before she'd even finished burying her. She straightened the display panel that was listing 3 degrees to the left, squared her shoulders, got to work. For the next hour she was the event's invisible architecture, refilling water glasses, redirecting guests, catching a centerpiece before an elbow sent it to the floor, doing the 1,000 small essential things that held an evening together and for which no one thought to say thank you. She didn't need thanks. What she needed was the research funding these evenings generated to keep climbing. She needed the woman sitting across from an oncologist somewhere next year to have more options than her mother had. 10 years of this, and she had never once needed more reason. The program began at 8. The chandeliers dimmed. The quartet faded into silence, and the MC took the podium, and the tribute video began. Faces filling the screen above the stage, names, dates, the specific quiet violence of dates that ended too soon. Women in their 30s and 40s and 50s who were someone's mother, someone's daughter, someone's person, the irreplaceable ordinary miracle of them rendered in photographs that could only ever approximate the real thing. The room went quiet in the way of 500 people, all holding the same kind of grief at the same time, all that private loss rising and mingling invisibly in the air. Lucia stood near the back wall and didn't arrange her face into anything. There was no one here who knew her. And grief that old deserved to be felt honestly, even in borrowed dresses at galas like this. She didn't notice the man at the head table immediately. She noticed his phone first. The blue-white glow of a lit screen in a darkened room during a memorial. Her eyes tracked to it with the automatic precision of a decade spent watching monitors in dark wards, and what she found was a man. Black suit, architecturally cut, the kind of tailoring that didn't advertise itself because it had no need to. Dark hair, a jaw drawn with a ruler. He was seated at the center of the head table with the unhurried ease of someone for whom the concept of belonging everywhere had simply never been in question. He had a stillness that should have looked like composure, but to Lucia's trained eye, it looked something closer to contempt. The stillness of a man who had stopped finding the world surprising and had not mourned the loss. He leaned sideways toward the silver-haired man beside him and said something low. The silver-haired man's mouth curved. From the podium, the MC read a name. A woman, 41 years old, 2 children under 10, and a husband who still couldn't talk about the immense loss. The man in the black suit glanced down at his phone again. Lucia set down the water pitcher. The decision, if it was a decision, occupied no measurable unit of time. There was no internal debate, no moment where caution asked to be heard. There was the pitcher on the table, and then her body moving and the crowd parting, and then the solid warmth of his shoulder under her hand as she tapped it, and then his face turning toward hers in the slow, unbothered way of a man who had genuinely never been caught off guard in his life. His eyes were very dark, almost black in the low light, and when they found her face they did something she would think about much later, in a different house and a different life. His eyes landed on her, fully and completely, like she was the first thing in the room, actually worth the cost of attention. She slapped him. The sound rang through the ballroom with the clean finality of a gavel strike. The quartet stopped mid-phrase. The MC paused at the podium, and every glass in the room froze somewhere between table and mouth. "Women died for this cause," Lucia said, and her voice came out the way it did on night shifts when a tired doctor was about to make a mistake she needed him to hear her correct. It was steady, low, and firm. "The least you can do is put your phone away and show some respect." Not a tremor, not even a step back. The silence had weight. And then, in her periphery vision, she became aware of the men. Not hotel security. These men had a different geometry, stationed at intervals around the room with a precision that had nothing to do with event management. She felt, with a cold clarity that arrived approximately 2 seconds too late to be useful, the movement of hands toward jacket interiors. The specific charged stillness of people waiting for a signal. Her body delivered the danger assessment that her adrenaline had been suppressing since she'd crossed the room. The man she'd slapped had not moved, had not flinched, had not looked away from her face. He raised one hand slowly, 2 fingers barely extended, the smallest possible expenditure of authority, and every hand and every jacket interior withdrew simultaneously, like a tide pulling back on command. The room exhaled. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has been searching for without knowing he was searching. Unhurried, almost wondering, and then from somewhere deep and completely unmanaged, arriving entirely without his permission, he smiled. It was something that moved across his face like weather, real and unstoppable. "You're not leaving tonight," he said, quiet enough that only she could hear it, and certain enough that it needed no volume whatsoever. Lucia drew breath. She had no shortage of responses. Then she felt a hand close around her elbow. The silver-haired man, firm and professional, the practiced grip of someone who had redirected unwilling people out of rooms so many times it had long since become reflex. "This way, signorina. Get your hand off of me." Lucia started, but then the hand tightened slightly. "Please," he said, with the genuine courtesy of a man who meant it completely but intended to proceed regardless. She walked, only because the alternative was undignified, and she had just spent the last of her available dignity on something that was becoming, with every additional second of new information, a considerably more complicated situation than she had originally assessed. The service corridor doors closed behind them, and the quartet resumed within seconds. The gala recomposed itself around the vacancy of what had just happened, the way these rooms always did when something true and human and irreversible briefly interrupted the performance. At the head table, Nico Carbone sat alone. He turned back to the screen. The tribute video was still running. Faces, names, dates. He watched all of it. This time he did not look at his phone. He sat with both hands flat on the tablecloth and watched every face and heard every name with the concentrated stillness of a man paying a debt he knew could never be fully settled. And when a face appeared midway through, a dark-haired woman laughing in a hospital bed, pink ribbon at her collar, with the exact stubborn set to her mouth as the woman who had just slapped him in front of 40 of his men, he went very still. Across the hotel, Lucia sat in the back of a car she had not agreed to enter, watching the Grand Meridian's lights shrink through tinted glass, running every available risk calculation and arriving each time at the same answer: that she was in serious trouble, and finding, underneath that answer, something she had no existing solution for. She was not as afraid as she should have been. She didn't know his name, didn't know the weight of it, the way it made rooms go careful in every city in the country. She only knew that he'd looked at her like she was extraordinary, and that it had felt, against every piece of available evidence, like being actually seen. She told herself firmly that this was the adrenaline talking. The car climbed north toward the hills, toward iron gates and rose-covered walls, and a life she hadn't agreed to and couldn't yet imagine, and Lucia Miller, who had once promised a dying woman she would never stop fighting for the things that mattered, sat in the dark and thought about a smile she was already, against her better judgment, failing to forget. And in a ballroom behind her, the most dangerous man in the country sat alone at a long table and watched women's faces move across a screen, and felt, for the first time in 4 years, something that was not quite guilt and not quite peace but lived quietly, somewhere in between. Neither of them slept that night, and neither of them could have explained exactly why. The next day, Lucia woke up angry. Not the slow, disoriented anger of someone forgetting where they are. Lucia knew exactly where she was within 3 seconds of opening her eyes, because she had not fully slept, only drifted in shallow intervals with her ears open and her mind running, the way she did during long night shifts when the ward was quiet but not safe. She had memorized the ceiling by 2 a.m. By 4 a.m., she had counted the security rotations outside her window twice. By the time pale light began pressing through the curtains, she had already formed, discarded, and reformed 3 escape plans with the focused pragmatism of a woman who had learned early that panic was a luxury and thinking was a tool. She tried the door first because she needed to know. Fortunately, it was unlocked. She stood in the doorway for a moment, genuinely surprised, and then stepped into the hallway in bare feet, her borrowed dress slightly worse for a night's sleep, and her hair fully committed to chaos now, and walked toward the staircase. There were 2 guards at the end of the corridor. Lucia tried to hide, but their eyes caught her before she could run away. They looked at her, and to her surprise they nodded, almost politely, and did not move an inch to try and stop her. She walked downstairs. She ran through the entrance hall, across marble flooring, and toward the front door with the frantic curiosity to see what would happen if she kept running until she escaped. Suddenly, a guard materialized from a side corridor with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been waiting for exactly this. He didn't need to stretch a hand to stop her. Lucia's legs halted the minute she spotted him. He gestured, almost gently, back toward the interior of the house. "Breakfast is ready, Signorina." "I don't want breakfast," Lucia argued. "The Don thought you might say that." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small paper bag. He asked the kitchen to make cornetti, the ones with pistachio cream. Lucia looked at the paper bag, then at the guard, then at the front door that was 10 feet away. "This is a bribe," she said. "Yes, Signorina." She took the bag. She was not remotely done trying to leave, but she had been on her feet for 17 hours yesterday, and her blood sugar had opinions. She followed the guard toward the kitchen with her spine very straight, and her jaw set in a way that clearly communicated she was making a strategic retreat, not a surrender, and she needed everyone present to understand the distinction. The kitchen was enormous and warm and smelled of espresso and something baked with butter, and sitting at the island with 2 cups already poured and a newspaper open in front of him was Nico Carbone. He looked different in daylight. She hadn't expected that. At the gala he had been all shadow and tailoring and the kind of authority that announces itself before a man speaks. But here, in a dark shirt with the collar open, the newspaper folded under one forearm. He was still all of those things, but there was something else too, something quieter. He looked like a man who had also not slept, though he wore it differently, the way people do when they are accustomed to operating on insufficient rest and have simply recalibrated their baseline. He pushed the second espresso toward her without looking up from the paper. She sat down, again strategic, not surrender, and pulled the cup toward her. "I need to call my work," she said. "Already done," he replied in a low but very audible voice. "You called my hospital?" she asked, anger rising in her voice. "Why would you do that? Your shifts are covered for the week, and your supervisor has been informed you have a family matter." "I don't have a family matter," Lucia spat. "I have been kidnapped." He turned a page of the newspaper. "The distinction may be lost on your supervisor." "I want to go home," Lucia demanded. "After 1 week," he said softly. "And do you think I'm stupid enough to believe that after a week you'd let me go?" Lucia scoffed. Nico smirked. "You make it seem like you have a choice." "You can't just," she started, then suddenly stopped. "Why?" she said instead, precise and flat. "I refuse to believe you kidnapped me just for fun, so tell me why and I'll decide whether it's worth arguing about." He closed the newspaper, looked at her properly for the first time since she'd walked in, and she felt it again, that quality of attention, total and undeflected, that had unnerved her at the gala for reasons she still hadn't satisfactorily resolved. "Because in 10 years, he said, no one has done what you dared to do last night. In front of those men, in that room." A pause. "I wanted to understand what that looks like when the adrenaline wears off." "And what do you think?" she probed. His eyes moved briefly across her face, the set of her jaw, the way she was holding the espresso cup with both hands like a weapon she hadn't decided whether to deploy yet, and something shifted at the corner of his mouth. "The adrenaline," he said, "appears to be structural." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up the pistachio cornetto and bit into it, because it was excellent and life was too short for performative hunger strikes. 1 week, she said finally. "And I want gardening gloves." He blinked, the smallest fracture in the composure. "Gardening gloves?" he asked. "The rose garden on the east side. It's been abandoned for at least 2 seasons. It's going to lose the climbers on the south wall if nobody cuts them back before the cold sets in properly." She finished the cornetto. "Do you want them to die?" The long silence stretched as Nico tried to wrap his head around what was going on. A few minutes ago, she had been frantically trying to escape, and now she seemed more worried about roses than her own life. "I'll have them sent up," he said. She nodded once, slid off the stool, and walked toward the garden with her coffee, and Nico Carbone sat in his kitchen watching her go with an expression that Sal, entering from the side corridor 30 seconds later, had genuinely never seen on his face before and did not know the name for. On day 2, Lucia found the key to the East Wing car on a hook near the laundry room. She'd been looking for it since breakfast on day 1. She waited until the guard rotation shifted at 10 a.m., then walked out to the garage with the calm purposefulness of someone who absolutely had permission and started the car. She was halfway down the private drive before the ground opened. Not literally, but almost. A reinforced gate rose from beneath the driveway tarmac with a hydraulic certainty that made it very clear this had not been improvised. Lucia sat with the car idling, looking at the gate, and understood that she had just lost a chess match she hadn't known was already in progress. The golf cart arrived 4 minutes later. The guard driving it had the carefully neutral expression of a man who'd been specifically briefed to not look even slightly amused. He drove her back to the house in silence. Nico was on the front steps. 2 coffees, 1 in each hand. He held one out as she stepped out of the golf cart. She took it and said nothing. He humored her by also saying nothing, and they stood on the steps in the thin morning sun drinking their coffees and looking at the middle distance with the mutual composure of 2 people who were absolutely both thinking about what just happened and had agreed, without speaking, not to address it directly yet. She tried 3 more times over the next 2 days to escape. The linen van, which earned her 4 hours of actual freedom before the driver recognized the Carbone house crest embossed on the sheet and drove her back pale-faced and apologetic, the poor man, Lucia genuinely felt bad for him. Then there was the kitchen delivery entrance during the fruit order, which was foiled so immediately that she suspected someone had anticipated it before she'd fully formed the thought. And finally, the young guard she attempted to win over with strategic warmth and the full deployment of her considerable interpersonal skills, only to be informed, with a blush so profound she almost felt guilty, that the Don had specifically told him she would try exactly this, and had described the smile she would use with an accuracy that made her briefly furious and briefly something else she refused to examine. That night, she didn't try anything. She went to bed early and lay in the dark and thought about the fact that a man who ran whatever kind of operation required 40 armed men at a charity gala had apparently spent part of his day thinking carefully enough about her specifically to brief his staff on her smile. She was not going to find that flattering. She found it absolutely infuriating and refused to feel anything else about it whatsoever. On the fourth night, she couldn't sleep and the house was quiet. So she wandered the corridor she'd been saving, the one off the east landing that a guard had steered her past twice with just enough imperceptible tension in his shoulders to tell her there was something worth knowing behind it. She'd clocked it on day one. She had simply been waiting for 2 a.m. and an empty hallway. The door was unlocked. She should have expected that by now. Nothing in this house was ever really locked. The whole place was a cage made entirely of open doors, which was somehow the most sophisticated cage she'd ever encountered. The room was small. A reading chair angled toward a window. A lamp. And everywhere, softly, in the amber quiet, a girl growing up. Photographs along the entire length of the windowsill, framed simply, chronologically. A gap-toothed child on a bicycle. A teenager laughing with gelato running down her wrist. A young woman at what looked like a university graduation in a cap that sat sideways on thick dark curls, her arm locked around a younger and visibly softer version of the man down the hall. His whole face different in that photograph. Open. Unguarded. The face of someone who had not yet learned to keep himself behind glass. On the desk, pressed flowers going papery at the edges. A small collection of pink ribbons. Research papers, printed and annotated, with passages underlined in a handwriting she recognized from the estate's internal correspondence as his. And a letter, handwritten, unsealed, beginning with 2 words that stopped her completely. Isabella. I'm sorry. She did not read further. She stood in that room for a long time without moving. Then she folded the silence of it carefully around herself and carried it back to her room and lay with it in the dark until morning, and something she'd been carrying in her chest since the first night, the hard bright coal of her righteous anger, shifted slightly, without her permission, into something that had more room in it. She brought him coffee in the morning, just appeared in the kitchen before he did, and made it the way she'd watched Rosa make it, then set it on the counter, and was apparently very interested in the garden from the window when he walked in. He saw the cup, then glanced at her back, picking it up without comment. They stood in the kitchen in silence for a while, separately occupied, and it was the most honest 10 minutes either of them had spent with another person in longer than they could say. She asked him about the foundation on day 5. Not gently. She had found the donor records in the library. Rosa had shown her innocently, proudly, and she had pieced it together the way she pieced together a patient's chart. She came to find him in his study and closed the door behind her and put the folder on his desk and said, "It's yours. The whole foundation. You built it." He looked at her steadily. "Yes." "Why?" Something moved behind his eyes, reorganized itself. "Because she died. And I had money, but I didn't know what else to do with the guilt." The room was very quiet. "So the research is actually real?" Lucia asked. "The funding actually goes." "Every cent," he said. "To the hospitals. To the trials. I can show you the accounts." She looked at him for a long time. Looked at the man who had designed a cage so sophisticated it had no bars, who had sent gardening gloves to a captive because she'd asked, who had written a letter to his dead sister that he never sent, and who had watched the tribute video alone at an empty table after she'd left. "Show me," she said. He opened his laptop. They sat across from each other in that study for 2 hours, and he showed her everything. The research grants, the hospital partnerships, the trial funding, the survivor programs. And she asked sharp clinical questions because she knew this field the way she knew the back of her own hand, yet he answered every one of them without deflection. Somewhere in the second hour the desk between them stopped feeling like a boundary and started feeling like a table where 2 people were working toward the same thing from different sides. She didn't tell him she'd been in Isabella's room. She didn't need to. He could see it, in the way she looked at him now, the slight adjustment in her eyes, the particular gentleness that had appeared in her honesty without softening it. But he didn't ask. He quietly understood. And in the understanding was something that needed no words, which was the most efficient kind of thing, which was the kind Lucia Miller respected most. That evening she found a single pink hospital ribbon on the kitchen counter. The kind she'd seen pinned to women in ward photographs. The kind her mother had worn. She picked it up and held it, looking at it for a long time. She pinned it to her cardigan, walked into dinner. He was already seated. He looked up when she came in, and his eyes found the ribbon immediately. Something crossed his face that moved through and was gone before it could be named, like a cloud's shadow on water, there and not there. He looked back at his plate. Nico refilled Lucia's wine glass without being asked. And for the first time, Rosa, watching from the kitchen doorway, had to press her lips together and look at the ceiling and conduct a swift internal argument with herself about professionalism. Dinner passed the way good dinners do, too quickly. He asked her about nursing, not as small talk, as genuine inquiry, and she found herself talking about her mother without planning to, the way you only talk about someone when you're somewhere safe enough to risk it. He listened the way people listen when they are genuinely interested and not simply waiting to respond, and she noticed this, and it disarmed her in ways she was rapidly running out of defenses against. On the 6th night, they ended up on the rooftop terrace by separate accident. She came up because she couldn't sleep. He came up for the same reason, though neither of them said so. The city spread below them in a smear of gold and amber, and they stood at the railing with a foot of space between them that felt simultaneously immense and negligible. She asked him about Isabella. Not carefully, the way people usually asked about the dead, all hedged softness and tilted heads. She just asked, what was she like? The way Lucia asked everything, straight and clean, like a door opening rather than a door knocking. And Nico talked about his sister for the first time since the funeral. Not a speech, not a tribute. Pieces of her, the way she stole his jackets and stretched the sleeves. How she laughed in restaurants too loudly and never once apologized for it. How she used to tell him, Nico, you're going to die surrounded by money and nobody you actually like. He said it looking out at the city, his voice perfectly steady, the steadiness of someone who had learned to carry weight by distributing it across the whole body rather than holding it in one place. When he stopped, Lucia was quiet for a moment. She wasn't entirely wrong, she said. Was she? He turned his head to look at her. The city light caught the edge of her face, the absolute unapologetic directness of her, the pink ribbon still pinned to her cardigan, and something moved behind his eyes that was not managed or performed. She's getting less right, he said quietly, by the day. The space between them on the railing didn't change, but it felt suddenly like a completely different kind of space, not a distance but a frontier. The specific charged stillness of two people who have arrived at the edge of something and are deciding, separately and simultaneously, whether to step. They stayed on the terrace until the sky began to lighten. Neither suggested leaving. Neither looked at their phone. When they finally went back inside, they did so in the unhurried silence of people who had found something rare and were being careful not to startle it. In the morning, Nico made one phone call. Clean money. No foundation routing, no laundering architecture. A direct transfer to the research hospital, under a name he had not spoken aloud since the funeral. Isabella Carbone. His first fully honest act in 4 years. And somewhere in the city, in an office he would never visit, a researcher's funding for a trial that would eventually save 11 women he would never meet was secured before breakfast. Sal stood in the doorway of the study and watched it happen, saying absolutely nothing, because some things are too significant for comment and wise men know the difference. The farmer's market was Nico's idea. Day 7. A loosening of the terms, a gesture toward trust. Supervised but gentle. 2 guards, civilian clothes, a Saturday morning market 30 minutes from the estate. He almost came himself. But at the last moment he didn't, and he would later be unable to fully explain to himself why, whether it was the residue of old habit or something newer and more difficult, the specific vulnerability of wanting to be there. Lucia walked through the market in the thin winter sun. She touched the tomatoes and talked to the flower vendor and looked, for 20 minutes, like someone who had simply been returned to her life and found it still fit. The guard was 3 steps behind her, relaxed, watching the crowd. He was watching the wrong direction when the car door opened. It happened in 11 seconds. A hand at her elbow, not the apologetic professional grip she'd come to know from Sal. This one was hard and purposeful and pointed. A voice at her ear that said her name, her full name, in a way that made it sound like something already owned. A black car with its engine running. She had a bit of time to register the face of the man taking her, young, angular, with a tattoo at the jaw she'd seen somewhere before and couldn't place. And then she was inside, and the door was closed, and the market went on around the empty space where she'd been standing as though nothing had happened. The guard turned around 40 seconds too late and found tomatoes on the ground and a flower she'd been holding but nothing else. And he reached for his phone with hands that for the first time in his professional life were not entirely steady. 30 minutes away, Nico's phone rang. He knew before he answered. He knew from the particular silence on the other end of the line in the half-second before Sal spoke. The silence of a man choosing his words with the care of someone who understands that what he says next will detonate something. "She's gone, boss." The room went very quiet. Not the quiet of a man absorbing news, but the quiet of a man who has just felt something he thought was sealed off in him break open with a speed and totality that left no room for management. When he spoke, his voice was perfectly level. The levelness of deep water, which is not calm, it is simply deep. "Who?" he asked.
If this story has its grip on you right now, you need to like this video, subscribe, and share it immediately. Because what happens next is the part that will completely shatter you. Drop a comment and tell us whether you think Lucia needed saving at all.
The room they put her in smelled like cigarettes and damp concrete, and the particular staleness of a space that had held frightened people before her. There was a single bulb, a chair, and a door with no handle on the inside. Lucia sat with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap and ran through everything she knew with the systematic calm of a woman who had worked enough night shifts in enough understaffed wards to understand that panic was simply the brain misfiring, and misfiring brains made poor decisions, and poor decisions in rooms like this one had consequences she could not afford. She was not going to panic. She was, however, going to be extraordinarily angry about this the moment she had the bandwidth. The man who'd taken her hadn't spoken since the car. Neither had the two who flanked him. She'd studied all three during the drive with the attention she usually reserved for patients presenting with ambiguous symptoms. The tattoo at the jaw she'd finally placed. She'd seen it on a man at the gala, far table, left side, watching Nico the way you watch something you intend to dismantle. She filed this away. The driver had a splint on 2 fingers of his right hand, poorly applied, the kind of amateur rap that meant either no access to medical care or just stubborn refusal of it. The wound was 4 to 6 days old and almost certainly infected. She could see the inflammation tracking up toward the wrist from the driver's seat mirror. She was still a nurse. Rooms like this didn't change that. The door opened, and the angular man came in without the others. He sat across from her and looked at her with the calculating patience of someone who had done this before and found it efficient. "You're going to help us," he said. "Or should I say, you're going to make Nico Carbone help us." "Help you with what?" Lucia asked. "He's going to sign 3 port territories to the Ricci family. In exchange, you get to go home." "And if he doesn't?" Lucia couldn't help but ask. The man smiled with only the lower half of his face. "Then you become a message." Lucia held his gaze without expression. "Your driver's hand is infected. If he doesn't get antibiotics in the next 24 hours, he risks sepsis. I'd tell him, but you seem like the person who makes decisions here." The man stared at her. "It's just information," she said evenly. "I give it to everyone. It's a professional habit." He left without responding. The door closed. She heard him say something sharp in the corridor, and then the muffled reply of the driver, and she sat back in her chair and let out one long, measured breath. Then she got to work. The soldier they sent to watch her was 19 at most, with the wary eyes of someone who had entered a life he hadn't entirely understood when he signed up for it. He stood by the door with his arms crossed and looked at the middle distance. Lucia looked at his left forearm where a burn scar ran from wrist to elbow, the type and pattern of it telling her immediately that it was a kitchen fire, probably childhood, and whoever had treated it had done a mediocre job with the graft. "That scar," she said. "Does it tighten in the cold?" He looked at her. "What?" "The scar tissue. Old burns like that tend to contract in cold weather. There's a stretching technique. Takes about 10 minutes a day. It makes a significant difference over time." He was quiet for a moment. "My mother used to rub oil on it. She wasn't wrong. Combination works better, though." He uncrossed his arms. Something in his posture changed. Not softened exactly, but more like a door that had been held firmly shut finding itself slightly ajar and not sure when that had happened. His name was Marco. He told her this approximately 40 minutes later during a conversation She had navigated there with the patience of someone threading a needle in low light. He was from the South. He had a younger sister. He'd joined the Ricci operation because the alternative had been nothing, and nothing had seemed worse at the time, and now nothing seemed considerably more appealing than it used to, but the path back to it was not straightforward. She listened. She was very good at listening, which is not the same thing as being passive. It was active, a practiced skill, making space for the truth to arrive in its own time. "Marco," she said eventually, "I need to get a message out." He looked at the door. Then at her. "Not to escape," she said. "I need Nico to know something. Something that changes what happens when he comes for me. If he comes in the wrong way, then people will get hurt, including people in this building." "I can't," he started, but he interrupted him quickly. "I'm not asking you to contact him directly. I'm asking you to take something to the flower vendor at the Saturday market, the one by the east entrance. Tell her a woman asked her to deliver this to the Carbone estate." She held up the pink ribbon she'd been wearing on her cardigan, the hospital ward ribbon. Nico's staff would know it. She was sure of this in the bone-certain way she was sure of very few things. Nico had briefed them on Isabella's ward colors. She had seen the pink in that room, in those photographs, repeated with the deliberateness of devotion. Marco looked at the ribbon for a long time. Then he finally took it, and Lucia said nothing else. She simply sat back in her chair and folded her hands and looked at the wall and allowed herself, privately, in the locked interior of herself where no one could catalog it, to feel afraid. Not because she thought it would help, but because feeling the fear fully and honestly was the fastest way through it, and she had learned this from her mother, who had been afraid every day for 2 years and never once let it make her smaller. She let it move through her. Then she put it away. And then she thought about what else she had. Because the walls in a building like this were thin, and the angular man whose name she'd since deduced was Ricci, a son, probably the middle one, she'd heard enough about the family structure in Nico's study to orient herself, had conducted 2 phone calls in the corridor outside her door with the noise discipline of someone who thought his prisoner was less attentive than she was. There was a buyer. Someone paying the Ricci family not just for the ports but for the removal, permanent and total, of Nico Carbone from the operational landscape. Someone internal. The phrase she'd caught twice was "the accountant confirms." She had no name, but she had the thread. She sat with it carefully, the way she sat with a diagnosis she wasn't yet certain of, turning it over, testing it against what she knew. The foundation accounts she'd reviewed in Nico's study. The numbers she'd moved through quickly, but her eyes had snagged on something. A pattern in the quarterly disbursements that hadn't fully resolved into meaning at the time. A consistent rounding. Small amounts, individually invisible, collectively significant over 4 years. Someone had been skimming from Isabella's fund. Someone who would be exposed if Lucia, with her clinical precision and her trained eye for the place where numbers didn't behave, spent enough time with those accounts. Someone who needed her gone as much as they needed Nico gone as well. The door opened again. The angular man came back in. He looked at her differently this time, a recalibration, slight but visible. He'd spoken to the driver. "Who are you?" he said. Not rhetorically. With genuine uncertainty, which was the most dangerous she'd felt since the car. "A nurse," she said. "That's all." He didn't believe her. She could see it. But he also didn't have a framework for what she actually was. A woman who had walked into the most powerful man in the country's life through a side door and hadn't been diminished by it. And the absence of framework made him careful in a way that bought her time. Time was all she needed. 40 miles away, Nico Carbone had not slept, had not eaten, and had spoken fewer than 30 words in 6 hours. This was not grief. Grief was something he knew, had learned the topography of, and could navigate. This was different. This was the specific unbearable quality of a situation where the thing at stake was not power or money or territory. The things he had built entire architectures of control around, but something that had no armor and could not be protected by strategy alone, and the helplessness of that was a flavor he did not know and could not metabolize. Sal watched him from the doorway of the war room and said nothing. The ribbon arrived at exactly 4 p.m. Carried by Rosa, who had received it from the flower vendor with shaking hands and brought it directly to Nico without stopping. He held it between 2 fingers and looked at it, and the room went very still around him. "She's alive," Sal said. "She sent it herself. She's telling us she's alive." Nico set the ribbon flat on the table. His hand stayed on it for a moment. Then he stood up and something in the set of him changed. The last remaining fragment of ordinary human agitation simply dropped away, and what was underneath was not rage, which burns and obscures, but something colder and cleaner and far more precise. "The ribbon is pink," he said. Isabella's ward was pink. "She knows we'd recognize it." He looked at Sal. "She's telling us she's thinking. She's telling us not to come in blind." "Boss, she found something in the accounts," Nico said. "That's why she was taken. It wasn't about the ports. The ports were the cover." He pulled the laptop toward him, opened the foundation files, moved through the quarterly disbursements with focused speed. 3 minutes. 4. Then he stopped. The rounding error. 5 years of it. Small, surgical, the kind of thing invisible unless you knew exactly what honest numbers looked like in that column. He followed the thread for 8 minutes in total silence. Then he sat back. "Ferraro," he said. His accountant. 12 years. The man who had managed the foundation accounts from the beginning. The man who had been present at every Ricci negotiation in the past 18 months, who had access to every port territory valuation, who knew exactly what Nico had and what it was worth and how to help someone else take it. Sal's face had gone the color of old ash. "Get me everything," Nico said. "And then get me 4 teams. Not through the front. Through the pharmaceutical warehouse on the Ricci South perimeter. Ferraro's fingerprints are on that lease. I want to know why." Sal was already moving. What followed was not a rescue in the cinematic sense. No convoy, no breach, no single man walking into fire. It was something quieter and more precise. The Ricci operation dismantled from 4 simultaneous pressure points with a precision that his men would talk about for years. Not loudly, but with the specific reverence of people who had witnessed something masterful. Every exit closed before anyone inside knew an entrance had been found. Every communication line severed in the correct sequence. The whole structure of the Ricci play, the buyer, the ports, the accountant, the leverage, collapsed inward in under 2 hours like a building whose foundations had been quietly, completely removed. Nico came for her himself. Not at the end, not after it was contained and safe and cleared. He came in the middle of it, through the pharmaceutical warehouse and down 2 corridors and through a door that Marco, standing aside, arms at his back, having made a decision that would quietly redirect the trajectory of his life, opened without being asked. She was sitting in the chair with her hands folded and her spine straight, and she looked up when he came in with the unhurried attention of someone who had been expecting him and was prepared to act unsurprised. For a moment neither of them moved. He looked at her the way you look at something you thought you'd lost. Not with relief exactly, which is too simple, but with the specific overwhelm of a person who had been running risk calculations for 6 hours and finds the numbers suddenly, completely, in their favor and doesn't yet know what to do with their own hands. "Your accountant was stealing from Isabella's fund," she said. "For years. The rounding is in the quarterly disbursements, 3rd column, consistent pattern. I saw it in your study." He was very still for a moment. "Are you hurt?" he said. "Nico." She called his name, but he cut her off. "Lucia." His voice was quiet. Absolutely quiet. "Are you hurt?" "No." He exhaled, one breath, long and slow, and in it she heard the whole of the last 6 hours, everything he hadn't said, everything that had been held at pressure behind the precision and the cold clarity and the 4 teams moving through the perimeter, and it undid her in a way that nothing else about him had quite managed. She stood up from the chair. He crossed the room in 3 steps and then stopped. Close enough that she could see him clearly, close enough that stopping required something deliberate, and he looked at her face with an honesty so complete and unmanaged that she felt it like a hand against her sternum. She reached up and straightened his collar. It didn't need straightening. They both knew this. His hand came up and covered hers briefly at his collar. 1 second. 2. Then he stepped back and said, "Let's go home," in a voice that had clearly not intended to use that word, but had used it anyway and was not going to address this. She followed him out without comment. But she was smiling at the back of his head, and this time, she didn't try to stop it. Ferraro was arrested before midnight. The evidence Nico presented was so comprehensive, so precisely documented, that the man's legal team reportedly spent 40 minutes in silence before speaking. The Ricci operation dissolved in the weeks that followed. Not violently, but structurally, which was always more permanent. Marco, the 19-year-old with the burned scar and the sister, was quietly relocated south with a sum of money that had no official origin and a note that said only the stretching technique works. 10 minutes a day. He told his sister about the nurse who'd explained it to him. She asked him what she was like. He thought about it for a while. Like someone who'd already decided not to be afraid, he said. Even when she should have been. The garden was ready in spring. Lucia had spent 3 months finishing what she'd started during captivity. Coaxing the climbers back along the south wall, replanting the beds Isabella had designed from the photographs, getting the roses to a state of something that could be called thriving rather than surviving. She knew the difference between the two. In her professional life, she had always known the difference. Nico found her there on a Tuesday evening in April when the light was doing something unreasonable to everything it touched, turning the white roses gold and the pink ones a shade that had no name. She was on her knees in the soil, sleeves pushed to the elbows, completely absorbed, and she didn't hear him come through the gate. He stood there for a moment and just watched her. This was something he had caught himself doing with increasing frequency over the past 4 months. Finding reasons to be in whatever room she was in, and then simply existing near her, the way you exist near a fire in winter, not grabbing at it, just allowing yourself to be warmed by the fact of it. He had told himself many things about this habit. None of them had been entirely honest. "You're going to ruin those trousers," he said. She looked up without startlement. She had heard him after all, and had simply chosen her moment. "They're already ruined. I ruined them 3 weeks ago." She sat back on her heels and looked at what she'd been doing, then at him. "Come and look at this." He crossed the garden and crouched beside her, and she pointed to where the south wall climbers had taken hold again. Thick new growth threading through the old trellis with the quiet insistence of something that had always intended to survive and had simply been waiting for the right conditions. "Isabella planted these," Lucia said. "Not as information. As something she was giving him." "I know," he said. "She was 16. She made me hold the ladder for 4 hours and complained the entire time that I was doing it wrong." Lucia smiled at the wall. "She sounds like she was exhausting. She was the best person I ever knew." Nico sighed. The garden held them in the particular quiet of late April. Birdsong somewhere above the east wall, the faint movement of the climbers in a breeze too gentle to feel. Nico was still looking at the roses, and Lucia was looking at his profile, and neither of them had moved, and the moment had the quality of something that had been building for so long that arriving at it felt less like a change and more like a recognition. "You didn't have to do this," he said quietly. "I know. You could have left. After everything settled. You could have gone back to your apartment and your shifts and your life and never." He stopped. Something moved in his jaw. "I wouldn't have stopped you. I know that too." He turned to look at her then, properly, the way he had looked at her in the ballroom, fully and without management, nothing behind glass. Up close like this, in the honest light of a spring evening with soil on her hands and her hair coming loose, she was the most real thing he had ever been near. The thought arrived with a simplicity that should have been frightening and somehow wasn't. "I don't know how to do this," he said. The words came out low and careful, the way he handled things he was afraid of dropping. "I know how to run an operation. I know how to walk into a room and make it afraid. I know how to bury people I love and keep moving because stopping was never an option." A pause. "But I don't know how to tell someone that the thought of them leaving makes the whole architecture of everything feel like it's been built on nothing." Lucia was very still. "I'm not asking you to stay because I need something from you," he continued, and his voice had the stripped quality of a man who had rehearsed nothing and was therefore saying only what was true. "I'm asking you to stay because every single day since you walked into my kitchen in that ruined dress and negotiated for gardening gloves, every single day has been the best day I've had in 4 years. And I am aware of how insufficient that is. I'm aware that I took your choice away first, and I have no right to stand in this garden and ask you for anything." He looked at his hands for a moment. "But I love you, and I needed you to know that regardless of what you do with it." The garden became very quiet. Lucia looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had sent a golf cart after her runaway car and left a pink ribbon on a kitchen counter and donated clean money under his dead sister's name before breakfast, and come through a warehouse and 2 corridors to find her himself when he could have sent anyone. She thought about the rooftop and the espressos and the way he listened, and the way he had said let's go home in a hallway in a Ricci building and clearly hadn't meant the estate. She reached over and took his hand, the one still resting on his knee. She took it the way she did everything, directly, without ceremony, without giving him time to brace. "Nico," she said, "I stayed only because I wanted to. I finished this garden because I wanted to. I have been wanting to for months, and the only reason I haven't said it is because I was waiting for you to catch up." He looked at her. "I love you too," she said simply. "And the next time you have a 10-minute speech's worth of feelings, you're allowed to just lead with that." Something broke open in his face. Not dramatically, not the way things broke in films, but quietly, the way a room feels when someone finally opens a window that has been closed for a very long time. He brought her hand up and pressed his mouth to her knuckles, and stayed there, and she felt the exhale against her skin and understood that she was holding something that had been held at pressure for 4 years and had finally, completely, been allowed to set itself down. They stayed in the garden until the light failed entirely. Neither of them suggested going in. The wedding was small. 12 people who genuinely mattered. Rosa cried from the start and did not attempt to conceal it, which Lucia had specifically told her was not only acceptable but required. She walked through the garden in something simple, ivory clean lines, the pink ribbon pinned at her collar like it had always been there, like it belonged there. At the end of the path Nico stood without his armor, which was the only way she had ever been interested in him, and watched her come toward him with the expression of a man who had been told once by his younger sister that he would die surrounded by money and nobody he liked, and who was currently in possession of evidence to the contrary so thorough and complete that it felt, almost, like she had arranged it. He thought she probably had. Lucia reached him, took both his hands, looked at him with the directness that had started all of this in a ballroom 7 months ago, that had seen through the black suit and the authority and the phone screen to whatever was worth confronting underneath. "I didn't come looking for you," she said, "and you had absolutely no right to keep me." A pause. "But somewhere between the golf cart and the rooftop and the espressos I stopped wanting to leave. And I think you started wanting to be the kind of man who deserves that." His hands tightened around hers. He looked at her for a moment, at the ribbon, at the garden around them, at the roses on the south wall that were back and climbing and unambiguously, defiantly alive. "I spent 4 years," he said quietly, "making donations in a dead woman's name because I didn't know how else to love her anymore. And then you slapped me in front of 40 of my men, for her, without even knowing it." He paused. "She would have liked you. She had no filter either." Rosa made a sound that was technically classified as a dignified sniffle and fooled no one. The garden held them, the roses and the late light, and the 12 people who knew what it had cost both of them to arrive at this particular moment. And Lucia Miller, who had once promised a dying woman she would fight for the things that mattered, looked at the man in front of her and understood that sometimes the things worth fighting for arrived in forms you never would have chosen and couldn't imagine living without. She had been late to a lot of things in her life, but she was exactly on time for this.
If this story kept you glued from the first slap to the last rose, then you already know what to do. Like this video, subscribe so you never miss a story, and drop a comment below telling us your favorite moment and where you're watching from. We'll see you in the next one.